Millionaire's daughter is kidnapped by her own stepmother. But fate turns the tables. You can't imagine what a stepmother was capable of doing to a black, disabled, legless girl. The cruelty reached such an absurd level that even those who have heard horror stories will be horrified by what happened here. The girl, just 8 years old, adopted by a generous-hearted millionaire, became the target of humiliation and prejudice within her own home. But what this woman plotted will shock you. Before continuing this absurd story, I want to know from you, from which city are you watching this narrative? Leave a comment and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see how far this stepmother's cruelty goes. Because from here on, the routine of humiliations that Isabella suffered will be revealed, and you will be even more indignant. It was night. The car engine was already running, ready for a silent escape. The stepmother, Viviane, grabbed the girl by the arms, dragging her fragile, defenseless body to the trunk. Isabella had no strength to fight back. Without her prosthetics, which had been deliberately hidden, she simply clung to the cold floor, trying to resist. "Please, don't do this to me," Isabella cried, her voice breaking. Viviane, her eyes filled with hatred, spat out the words as if she were spitting poison. "Shut up, you useless thing. You should never have entered this house." These were insults the girl was already familiar with. Days and nights of hearing that she was useless, a burden, and a disgrace to her family. But this time it wasn't just humiliation, it was the beginning of a kidnapping. Viviane roughly lifted her and threw her into the trunk. The sound of her small body hitting the back of the car echoed like a sentence. The girl curled up, sobbing. "Daddy! Daddy will save me!" The stepmother gave a dry laugh. "Your father, he's blind. He only thinks about money, about business. You're nothing but a nuisance." With steady hands, she pulled the trunk lid shut. She was about to close the child's fate when a voice cut through the air like a blade. "What do you think you're doing, Viviane?" Her heart almost stopped. When she turned around, she saw her husband, Roberto, standing at the garage door. The millionaire watched the scene with wide eyes, somewhere between fury and disbelief. Isabella, from inside the trunk, stretched out her arms and shouted, "Daddy, help me!" Roberto stepped forward, filled with cold rage. "Open now, Viviane. I said now." Viviane tried to improvise, stuttering. I was playing with her. It's a joke. You know how dramatic kids are." But the lie sounded weak compared to the cruel image he had just witnessed. Roberto pushed her aside and, with a swift movement, opened the trunk. The girl threw herself into his arms, crying and clinging to her father's neck. The silence that followed was crushing. Only the car engine continued to roar, a witness to that dark night. Roberto looked at Viviane, and in that look, she understood. Her life of luxury, comfort, and status was about to crumble. "You will pay for what you did, Viviane. You will pay for every tear that girl shed." His deep, controlled voice sounded more threatening than any shout. Viviane, pale, took a step back, knowing she was cornered. If you thought what Viviane tried to do that night was cruel, you need to understand that it didn't start suddenly. The truth is, Isabella already bore scars long before that kidnapping attempt. Scars that weren't visible on her skin, but in her soul. Every morning, the girl woke up early, alone. Her room was at the back of the mansion, away from the other rooms. A cold, undecorated place, almost like a storage room. Unlike the luxurious surroundings of the house, the space where Isabella lived seemed designed to remind her that she didn't belong there. Viviane always entered abruptly, slamming the door. "Come on, lazy bones. It's as if you don't do anything with your life other than give people trouble." The first evil came early, the prosthetics. Isabella couldn't walk without them, but Viviane always found a way to make things difficult. Sometimes she hid them. Other times she deliberately loosened the straps, causing the girl to fall in the hallway. And when she fell, her stepmother didn't help. On the contrary. "Look, you're not even good enough to pretend to be normal," he said, laughing out loud. Isabella choked back her tears. She learned that tears only fueled Vivian's hatred, but it was impossible not to be hurt by those words. At mealtimes, the cruelties continued. While the dining room table was laden with food, Vivian would leave Isabella a smaller, often cold, plate. "Real food is for those who deserve it. You can thank my husband if you want. If it were up to me, you'd be starving." And there was still the most painful poison, racism. "Do you really think you fit in with this family? Look at your skin color. Look at your face. Even without legs, you're cheeky," she said, still with that venomous smile. Isabella lowered her head. Sometimes she considered telling her father, but always decided against it. Roberto was always traveling, in meetings, taking care of business, and when he showed up, Vivian knew how to manipulate the situation, portraying herself as the perfect, attentive wife. One day, the girl tried to approach her father and show him a drawing she'd done at school. Vivian grabbed the paper from her hand before he could see it and tore it up in front of the child. "That's rubbish. Don't bother your father with nonsense." And Roberto simply didn't notice. He just went about his hurried routine, believing his daughter was fine. But even amidst so much pain, Isabella had a different glow. There was a quiet strength within her, a hope that Vivian couldn't extinguish. At night, when her stepmother slept, the girl would talk to the moon through the window. "One day, I will be free. One day, I will show that I am stronger than her." And it was this small flame of resistance that, without knowing it, kept Isabella alive until that night when the kidnapping almost happened. Vivian wasn't born evil, but she let resentment take over her to the point of losing any semblance of compassion. Since marrying Roberto, the life of luxury seemed like a prize. A mansion, travel, expensive clothes. There was only one thing that bothered her, the presence of the adopted girl. Every time I looked at Isabella, I felt a mixture of disgust and anger. A black child, crippled. "And yet he treats her like a princess," she muttered to herself in front of the mirror, her eyes filled with envy. For her, Isabella represented an obstacle. She was a vivid reminder that Roberto was kind, that part of his heart was turned to someone other than her, and it ate at her insides. One night, while browsing a glass of wine in the luxurious living room, Vivian let her resentment turn into an idea. If that girl disappeared, everything would be easier. Roberto would finally look only at me. The idea seemed absurd, but the more she thought about it, the more logical it seemed. And before long, it became an obsession. She began planning every detail. First, her husband's absences. Roberto would spend weeks on business trips, trusting Vivian to care for their daughter. Then, the girl's vulnerability. Without legs, she was completely dependent on her prosthesis and the goodwill of those around her. And finally, Vivian's connections, acquaintances from the time she lived surrounded by questionable people before her marriage. That's how she decided to call one of them. Claudio, a cold man, involved in petty crimes, always willing to make easy money. "I have a job for you, simple, a child. I need him to disappear," he said, his voice icy. On the other end of the line, the man didn't hesitate. "Child, that's heavy, but everything has a price. Money isn't a problem." "I just want her out of my life," Vivian replied without hesitation. The arrangement was quick. On a specific night, Vivian would deliver the girl to the trunk of the car. Claudio and his cronies would take care of the rest. She didn't want to know the details. She didn't want to dirty her own hands any more than they already were. But even so, she couldn't resist the cruel pleasure of imagining. She closed her eyes and saw Isabella crying, begging. For Vivian, it was like a personal victory, destroying the thing that irritated her the most. She even looked at herself in the mirror and laughed. Who will miss her? She's nothing. She's nobody. It was this hatred that drove her, an obsession so strong that she couldn't see the danger. The greater the cruelty, the greater the fall. While Viviane fed her mind with hatred and cruel plans, Isabella, despite her small size, found strength in simple places. The girl had no legs, but she had dreams. She didn't have her stepmother's support, but she had a hope that grew like a root in dry soil. At school, for example, she could breathe. Teachers and some classmates saw her as a bright child with a shy but genuine smile. Among them all, there was someone special, Professor Lucia, a middle-aged woman, firm but sweet, who treated Isabella with dignity. One afternoon, while helping the girl adjust the prosthetics that Viviane had purposely left out of adjustment, Lucia said in a low voice, "Don't listen to what she says about you, Isa. You have value. You are strong." Isabella lowered her eyes, murmuring, "But she always says I'm useless, that my father doesn't need me." Lucia held her little face with both hands. "Your father may not see everything now, but one day he will. And even if he doesn't see it, you already have value just by existing. Never doubt that." These words became an anchor for the girl. At night, alone in her cold room, she would repeat to herself like a prayer, "I have value, I am strong." Meanwhile, Viviane couldn't bear to see any sign of joy in her stepdaughter. Whenever she saw the girl smiling, she tried to snuff out that sparkle. "What's that in your hand?" he asked once, snatching a notebook from the girl. It was an essay in which Isabella wrote about her dreams of becoming a writer. Viviane tore the paper into pieces, throwing them in the trash. "You'll never amount to anything. Learn to be content with what you are, a dead weight in this house." Isabella swallowed hard. She felt like crying, but she didn't give Viviane the pleasure. She simply kept in her heart the promise to one day prove that she was more than her stepmother claimed. There were times when loneliness was so pressing that the girl would talk to herself with the moon through the window. "You hear me, right?" he whispered. "One day I'll be free. I'll show her that she doesn't own my life." The moon didn't respond, but that glow up there was enough to make her believe she wasn't completely alone. And this silent force, invisible to the naked eye, was precisely what bothered Viviane the most. "How is it possible?" she muttered to herself. "Not even with all the humiliation will this girl break completely." Anger grew, and with it, the certainty that only a definitive end to Isabella would solve the problem. The kidnapping plan was no longer just an idea. It was an ongoing obsession. Viviane had already made her decision. There was no turning back. The hatred she felt for her stepdaughter transformed into an almost unhealthy energy, pushing her deeper and deeper into the darkness. She believed there was only one way to erase Isabella from her life: hand her over to men capable of doing her dirty work. That week, he called Claudio again. His voice was deep and drawling, like someone accustomed to negotiating the seedier side of life. "So, are you serious? You're really going to hand me a child?" he asked bluntly. Viviane took a deep breath, holding the wine glass tightly. "I already told you. I don't care what they're going to do. I just want her gone." On the other end of the line, Claudio chuckled softly. "This will cost a lot. Children are a problem. The police won't let up." "There's no shortage of money," she replied coldly. "My husband is a millionaire, and he'll never suspect a thing." The silence that followed was like a sealed pact. Claudio understood there was no room for hesitation. "Okay, let's set a date. You put it in the trunk, deliver it to me at the agreed-upon location, and that's it. The rest is up to me." Viviane smiled with satisfaction. Perfect. In the following days, he began to prepare everything meticulously. She pretended to be more attentive to Isabella, so the girl wouldn't suspect anything. She brought food to her room, asked about school, even helped with her clothes. But behind that false attention lay only calculation. "It'll be easy," he murmured in front of the mirror. "So easy, no one will miss it." the night before the scheduled date? He met Claudio in person at a remote bar on the outskirts of town. The man was accompanied by another accomplice, a short, quiet man who simply observed. Claudio lit a cigarette and spoke bluntly. "You understand what you're asking for, right? This is no joke. Once delivered, there's no going back." Vivian stared at him without blinking. "That's exactly what I want." He exhaled the smoke slowly, as if testing the client's steadfastness. "You have courage, woman. But remember, if you open your mouth, you'll fall with it." Vivian shrugged. "I won't open my mouth." The three clinked glasses of cheap beer as if celebrating some kind of deal. But this was no ordinary contract. It was the sentence of an innocent child. On the way back to the mansion, Vivian felt a strange excitement. Her heart was beating fast, but not from fear. It was from satisfaction. "Finally, I'm going to get rid of her," he repeated softly, like a mantra. Little did he know that this plan, which seemed perfect in his sick mind, would be the very beginning of his own downfall. The mansion's clock seemed to conspire with the plan. Each tick brought Vivian closer to the moment when she believed she would finally regain control of her life. The house dawned with the piercing silence of normal days, and no one suspected the fury simmering beneath the polished surface. In the kitchen, Vivian made a point of preparing breakfast with practiced sweetness. She smiled at her husband, kissed his cheek, and after he hurried off to another meeting, she returned to her calculating self. When she went to Isabella's room, she brought a piece of cake, straightened the blanket, and spoke softly. "Come on, honey. Your dad asked us to take a walk before I go to work. Let's just take a short walk, okay? I promise I'll be back soon." Isabella, who had learned to distrust Vivian's sweetness, hesitated for a second. Still, the shy glow of excitement from the outing with her father persuaded her to accept. They put on the prosthetics. Vivian pretended to hold them carefully, but she had left subtle latches loose again. The girl wouldn't notice until she moved. On the way, Vivian turned on the radio and took care to keep the conversation light, the sarcasm dead in her voice. The child, sitting in the back seat, watched the streets and tried to ignore the knot in her stomach. Sometimes she glanced back at her reflection in the mirror, searching Vivian's eyes for any trace of affection, but saw only cold conviction. They arrived at the garage with the excuse that the car was ready for a drive. Vivian parked near the exit gate, checked for anyone watching, and, with the calm of someone repeating a gesture, opened the back door. It all happened as quickly as it was calculated. A movement. A jumble of words, and little Isabella, her prosthetics loose, was shoved into the trunk. The sound of her body hitting the interior carpet resounded like thunder in the minds of those who heard it. "Stop!" the girl screamed, her hands searching for support that didn't exist. "Stop, please." Vivian feigned theatrical surprise, her voice trembling like an actress. "What are you doing? No, it's nothing like that," she said loudly, turning out of the car as if she'd been caught in the act by a stranger. However, the real surprise was something else. Roberto showed up earlier than expected. He'd returned to retrieve a forgotten document, and fate would have it that he stumbled upon just that scene. His steps were quick. He opened the trunk in one gesture and, without hesitation, lifted Isabella into his arms. The girl's body trembled. Tears burst out loud, and Vivian's charade crumbled under her husband's furious gaze. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice low but heavy. Vivian tried to construct an excuse, trembling. I was going to take her to a party. It was nothing major." "Calm down, Roberto. You're exaggerating." But contradictions leaped from every corner. The girl's wrinkled clothes, the deliberately ill-fitting prosthetics, the child's labored breathing. Roberto held Isabella tightly, protecting her, while Vivian's face paled, the lie dissolving. It was at that moment that the tension that had been building for weeks exploded. Harsh words, restrained accusations, and the weight of everything Vivian had been doing came crashing down. And even though he didn't fully understand every detail at the time, Roberto knew something terrible had been planned. His presence, implacable as a wall, transformed the scene, the kidnapping attempt, which Vivian had imagined would be silent and perfect, became blatant and public. And in that instant, the ruin she herself had sown began to germinate. Roberto wasn't a man to shout. His demeanor had always been that of a controlled businessman, accustomed to cool negotiations. But that night, when he saw his daughter in the trunk, all the calm built over years of meetings and contracts crumbled. He held Isabella against his chest, feeling her heart racing, her body trembling as if it would never stop. He looked at Vivian and, in a low, almost whispered voice, asked, "Were you really going to hand over my daughter?" Vivian took a false step forward, her eyes wide, trying to string words together. "No, you don't understand. I just wanted to scare," Roberto interrupted, cutting the air with his deep voice. "A scare? Inside the trunk, without prosthetics, crying like that? You call that a scare?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Vivian tried to maintain her composure, but sweat was pouring down her forehead. Her face looked like someone cornered, but she still insisted on denying it. "She's lying, Roberto. You know how children are. They make things up. They exaggerate." It was then that Isabella, still sobbing, lifted her head from her father's shoulder and murmured, "Daddy, she always treats me badly. She hides my legs. She doesn't let me eat properly. She always says I'm a burden to you." The words came out shaky, but each syllable felt like a surefire blow. Roberto hugged her tighter, closing his eyes for a second. When he looked back at Vivian, his gaze was no longer wavering. "I want you to get out of my house. Now." Vivian's eyes widened, her voice breaking. "You can't do this to me. I'm your wife. You have no proof of anything." Roberto came closer. So close that she backed away until her back was against the car. "Evidence? I saw you with my own eyes trying to throw my daughter into a trunk. That's enough." Vivian was breathing rapidly, almost desperately. She tried to find a loophole, a way out, any excuse that would save her. I just wanted... I can't stand sharing you with that girl anymore. She's nothing to me. She's not my flesh and blood." Roberto exploded, raising his voice for the first time. "And that's precisely why she needs me more than ever. Because I chose her, Vivian. I adopted her. She's my real daughter." Those words fell like a hammer on Vivian. Her face contorted into a mixture of hatred and despair. For a moment, it was clear she had no regrets. Her gaze still held the same resentment, and it was at that moment that red lights began flashing outside the gate. Roberto had already called the police before entering the garage, suspicious of the car's idling noise so late. Fate had given Vivian one last chance to confess, but now there was no more time. The sirens echoed down the silent street, bringing with them the weight of approaching justice. Red and blue lights flooded the garage, reflecting off the white walls like open wounds. The sirens ceased, replaced by the creak of doors opening and firm footsteps echoing through the yard. 2 police officers appeared, guns lowered but posture alert. Roberto still held Isabella in his arms, protecting her as if the whole world might try to tear her away. The girl buried her face in her father's shoulder, breathing in sobs, clinging to him as if it were her last anchor. "What's going on here?" one of the officers asked, his flashlight in hand illuminating the car with the trunk still open. Vivian, pale, took a step forward, trying to regain control of the situation. Her voice was shaky, but filled with false conviction. "It's a misunderstanding. I was just joking with the girl, and my husband misinterpreted it." Roberto interrupted her, his anger still contained, but firm as steel. Are you kidding? Putting a legless child in a trunk is a joke? He turned to the officers, his voice thick with indignation. This woman was handing my daughter over to criminals. The officers looked at each other. The scene before them needed little explanation. The crying child, the open trunk, the look of terror on the girl's face. Everything spoke louder than any excuse Viviane could offer. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us to clarify the facts," said the older police officer, already approaching her. Viviane took 2 steps back, her hands raised as if trying to hold the air. "No, you don't understand. She lies. That girl always lies." It was at that moment that Isabella lifted her face, still wet with tears, and faced her stepmother with unexpected courage. Her voice was low but firm. "I don't lie. You always hurt me. You always said I was worthless. You always hid my legs." The officers turned their eyes to Viviane. The mask she was trying to maintain began to crack. Roberto held his daughter more carefully, almost as if to shield her from the poison. "You will answer for this, Viviane," he said. Looking directly into her eyes, desperation began to set in. Viviane felt the wall closing in behind her, the uniforms in front of her, and the weight of Roberto and Isabella's words. She breathed quickly, as if sensing there was no way out. The night, which she had planned to end with her silent victory, turned into an open-air courtroom. Every look, every gesture, every detail screamed her guilt, and even if she tried to deny it until the end, there was no turning back. Justice was there, at her door. Viviane knew the noose was tightening. The police were already approaching to handcuff her. Roberto was looking at her with contempt, and Isabella, frail as she was, had exposed the venom she'd been spewing for years before everyone. The mask had slipped, and only raw desperation remained. Suddenly, as if seeing a single opening, Viviane gave one of the officers a sharp shove and ran towards the mansion's gate. "Stop her!" Roberto shouted, but the woman was already running, her heels clicking on the asphalt like hurried gunshots. The street was empty, lit only by the headlights of police cars. Viviane ran without looking back, her breathing ragged, tears mixed with sweat. A single thought hammered in her head. "I can't lose everything. I can't lose." The police officers shouted orders, but she didn't listen. With every step, she seemed to flee not only from the law, but from the guilt itself that was finally catching up with her. The cold wind slapped at her face, reminding her there was nowhere to escape. And then, it happened. A car sped past an intersection. The driver didn't have time to react. The headlights illuminated Viviane's body for a second, racing out of control, and the impact was sharp and violent, like a thunderclap that split the dawn. The metallic sound echoed down the street. Her body was thrown several meters, hitting the ground with a thud that chilled everyone present. The police ran toward her, but they no longer had the strength to flee. Viviane was still conscious, but each breath was accompanied by a hoarse moan. Her lost gaze turned toward the mansion, where Roberto held Isabella in his arms. For the first time, there was no hatred in her stepmother's eyes, only the bitter knowledge that it was all over. One of the officers bent down, assessing the severity of the injuries. "For she'll survive, but she'll be scarred for life. The impact was devastating." Roberto didn't answer. He just turned his face to his daughter, stroking her tear-soaked hair. "It's over, Isa. It's over." And, in a suit, Viviane's desperate race led her not to freedom, but to ruin. The body that had always carried arrogance was now broken, condemned to rely on medical devices for the rest of her life. Justice, brutally and unexpectedly, had been served. The days that followed were unlike anything the mansion had ever witnessed. The place, once filled with luxury and silence, now bore invisible scars, memories of the fear, tears, and hatred that had nearly destroyed an innocent life. Viviane survived the accident, but she was no longer the same. Her body was broken, supported by medical devices, tubes, and irons that were now her new reality. The woman who once paraded around in expensive heels and designer clothes now depended on a wheelchair, nurses, and the cold gaze of doctors who repeated daily, "You will never walk again." Every breath was accompanied by pain. Every movement reminded him of the price of his choices. And, perhaps most cruel of all, there was no more luxury, no more status, just a hospital room, the smell of medicine, and the uncomfortable silence of loneliness. Meanwhile, Isabella, despite the trauma, found a new beginning. Roberto became more present, finally understanding how much his daughter had suffered without him realizing it. The love that was once distracted now became whole. At school, Isabella smiled again. Teacher Lucia's words resonated louder than ever. "You have value. You are strong." And now she believed, not because someone told her, but because she had survived the worst and still had hope in her heart. Fate had reversed the roles. The girl, once a victim, became a symbol of resilience. The stepmother, previously arrogant and cruel, became a hostage to her own fragility. Once, Roberto visited Viviane in the hospital. She looked at him with tired eyes, perhaps expecting a gesture of pity. But he simply said, "You reaped what you sowed, and I hope that, in the silence of this bed, you reflect on every tear you made my daughter shed." Viviane closed her eyes without responding. There was no defense possible. History left a lesson etched like a scar. Evil, no matter how powerful, always digs its own grave. Hatred first corrodes those who feed it. Viviane believed she would destroy Isabella, but in the end, she was destroyed by her own cruelty. And Isabella, the girl who was so often called useless, proved to be stronger than anyone imagined. She didn't just survive, she won. And now I want to hear from you. What did you think of this turn of events? Do you believe justice was served? Or did Viviane deserve an even worse fate? Leave your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to say from which city are you watching this story. And of course, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss the next stories full of emotion and reflection.